of those, we need to work on these connections. It's incumbent upon us to have these kind of conversations. It's really great that I can learn a lot from you, and maybe you can learn a little bit from me, but I think when we're in conversation together, the PA makes much more sense than it ever has before, because Haiti is a sort of this long history, right? This is why my students love it, because it's just a really long history. So if you want to see what white colonialism and white settler colonialism and the violence of that, all you need to do is sort of start going into that long history. So that's not an answer. It's great that we're having it as a question, though.
I just want to give a reference. Charles Tilly has a very good article, very small article in a long-time book, he passed away, called Bringing the State Back In. I mean, the title is also a problem, as if the state has ever left. Right? But the article is called State Making as Organized Crime. And he goes through the whole European history, when state making and talks about it. And actually, I forgot to say I used to call you Amma Abu Saleh, and I'm going to continue to do that, out of respect. You were on the first page of my dissertation, and I actually used that to talk about what happened when Oslo happened, because of the 1999 statement of the 20s that you signed. And this, I find that actually a very small article, but it's very telling about what state making entails and so on and so on. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'm not sure if I have a question. I'll try to formulate it as a question. But I want to thank you all, really. It's just been so enriching and wonderful to be in this space with you. I want to go back to Mamira's paper. It's just fascinating and so important and so relevant. And I was thinking of Palestine the whole time you were speaking. And it brought me back to my own work. I do a little bit of research on the mandate, on the period of the British colonial state that facilitated the Zionist colonization of Palestine. And I was really thinking exactly what you said. The parallels are so important. You can see, as Rana said, the beginning of the commodification of land, but you also see that working very much hand in hand with the construction and codification through law of racial categories. And how these both work to facilitate a settler acquisition of land, to facilitate the settler colonization of land, both the commodification of land and the logics of capital, but also white supremacist racial categories inscribed through law, working hand in hand to reinforce a project of settler colonization, which in my own work has really reinforced the importance for me of thinking about the way that these systems work intimately. And again, to come back to, I guess, Rob and Kelley's point, to see them, these systems of oppression as not intersecting, but really the way that they work co-constitutively, perhaps, and how important that is for us, I think, in formulating our own understandings of radical pedagogy, and maintaining that understanding and maybe theorizing it more. I think if you think about, I'm looking also at the PLO and different writings of the PLO, and how, at the one hand, they were using the works of Cabral to sort of respond to white Marxists and to formulate a third world understanding of capitalism and global capitalism and the way that it worked. At the same time, theorizing settler colonialism in their own ways and forms, and making interesting connections about how the circulation of settler colonial violence also works through a logic of capital accumulation. It's really interesting material, and how in our own radical traditions we've kind of been theorizing and understanding these forces systemically in the way that they work. Where does that lead to a question, I guess, about
that's the conversation.
The importance of this type of, I guess, theorizing in our own traditions and the pedagogies within our movements, and allowing us to sort of develop that type of shared analytic that can then be brought into the classroom. I would love if you could comment on that. We didn't really get to talk about pedagogies of movements, but of course this is the incredible work of Rob and Kelley's book, and of course Rabab Abdulhadi has so much experience and knowledge to share in this regard. But I feel like we're at a critical juncture where Black radical tradition has responded to Marxism so powerfully, and also Indigenous scholars are responding and creating new conceptions, and also responding to Marxism in different ways, that we're at a juncture where we can kind of bring some of these traditions maybe together, and just at least not to forget that history upon whose shoulders, I guess, we stand.
That's a beautiful formulation, and I think it's really critical part of what I was trying to talk about this morning, but I think all of us in our own way raised, is what are the sources of new epistemologies? And that, there's so much work being done outside of the academy within these social movements, work that we don't read, or we read as a primary source, or we read as some kind of historical document, but not as a critical analysis. And so part of, I was talking to Rana, because she's teaching Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, and part of what he was able to do was he wasn't identifying the Black radical tradition in these Black intellectuals. He wasn't saying that C.L.R. James or W.B. Du Bois or Richard Wright or Fanon or anyone is the Black radical tradition. He's saying that they discovered it. They discovered it by studying movements like the revolution in Haiti, like Black Reconstruction, so-called ordinary people who produced a vision of understanding both the nature of slavery, of forms of domination, but also, more importantly, what were the sources of revolt? What were the sources of rebellion? And those rebellions demonstrated that there's no such thing as a universal subject, universal proletariat, that part of what they were coming out of were the kind of cultural matrix of their lives, memories, experiences. And this goes back to Rana's point of, and Rabab's point as well, we have to ask different questions, otherwise we end up continuing to center settler-colonialism. Because you center settler-colonialism within a dialectic in which settler-colonialism produces this opposition, as opposed to sources of opposition that come from other places. And I think that's really, really important, and that's why I really do think that opening up the walls of the university is not about trying to find native knowledge. It's not about trying to sort of, bring knowledge to the people and that kind of stuff. I have students and colleagues who think what we need to do is teach the people. No, you make new ideas together, and you're seeing people as a resource, not as the objects of study. And I think that's really, really different. And social movements do exist. They never did not exist. And out of those movements produce new knowledge that I think we have to pick up. So that's why I really appreciate the way you formulated it and thought about it. I have lots to say, but I'm trying not to say too much. So
I think there is a couple of things that, in terms of questions of Marxism and Palestine, in my work and that I've been doing before and continuing as both as a scholar as an activist, I think it's very interesting because I wouldn't even say it necessarily writing against Marxism. I think it's conversing with Marxism. It's a dialogical, and I'm talking dialogue because dialogue has a bad word in Palestinian context. But dialogical relationship with Marxism, in the sense that a lot of people think, and because a lot of the sources are in English, and I think this is part of what Majid was talking about today, is using Palestinian sources. And I don't think that he was implying, or anybody who's doing that is implying, I noticed you because you already know Majid, so that wasn't a criticism of that. There is a lot of sources that exist in multiple languages that actually never get to move to the currency and the primacy of academic knowledge, because they're not, again, the sexy context of understanding, and kind of like you mentioned Cabral as part of the earlier ways of thinking about learning and pedagogy and so on, before the pedagogy of the oppressed of Paulo Freire. There is also earlier ones, and we were talking about, for me, Azzeddin Qassam, the way Azzeddin Qassam articulated things. And Majid was saying, I go back to Ibn Khaldun, and I'm kind of like a bit, weary of Ibn Khaldun because of his over-rationality and so on. So I'm kind of, I don't like rationality too much. But I think there is a lot of ways in which I can think about, there is all that. But I think with Palestinian Marxism, one of the things that completely gets ignored, and we only think about Europe, we think about Western Europe. And there is a wealth of information about where, and Mamira was saying, we met in New York, but there are multiple other places. Paris was a very big, but Moscow, Eastern Europe, Cuba, This is what the international youth festivals. This is where people met. This is where people interacted with each other. This is where they had a lot of discussions. Some of us were more the generation of the World Conferences on Women, Nairobi, Mexico, Copenhagen, etc., etc. But there is all these places in which that doesn't get addressed, and now because of the declassification of the East German archives, the GDR, and Moscow, and so on, there is a lot of information that's coming out where people met, where is all of this, that's actually people are not talking about, because the knowledge produced is not produced in languages, and some of it is in Arabic, and in Persian, and in various other languages that don't seem to matter in the overall value of knowledge, which has a market value attached to it, especially in the neoliberal, English-dominated way of producing knowledge. So I think that's really fascinating for me, partly because I am part of that tradition, but also because I think this is where Palestinian left within the left and outside of the left, including within centrist forces, actually did a lot of their thinking and did a lot of their engagement. So I think that's one big part to look at.
I'm told that we should be, but Omar has a question, so let's, Omar, على السريع, and then...
A very small one. Thank you for this great day. I'm going out with an emotional and mental status that reminds me of the 2 years ago imprisonment and incarceration conference. But I can't end without asking this question and move it to Lina and Eileen. Where are the youth, the Palestinian youth?
Home?
Here? On the panels, on the conference, on the talks, like the round table about teaching Palestine is like, it's 5 above 40 years old men. They're all my beloved teachers, maybe Ala is 39. But anyway, there's no, there are no young voices. We are all active in many groups and movements that have connections with Black Palestine and with many queer movements and groups in Europe and in the US. So and it's not the first time. Sorry, but it's not the first time that nobody aren't we as students, not as an activist, but at least as students, aren't we a part of the Palestinian higher education institutions? Why have 5 professors or lecturers? We are also part of the experience. So
just to be fair, that actually the colleagues in Birzeit wanted to have 2-day conference, and there were several places to talk about students and youth and several sessions, and I was I was responsible for the decision to say 1 day, and as a result some sessions got sacrificed because Robin Kelley is only able to be here in Palestine for 3 days, and we wanted to. I'm blaming it on you. No, I made the decision. Robin wasn't aware of it. Okay, but he's here in Palestine for only 2 days, and we wanted to make sure that both institutions with whom we work, An-Najah and Birzeit, benefit. So as a result of that, some of the stuff got cut. I'm not talking about qualitatively that your criticism is not valued, but I'm just saying this is also part of what happened. I mean, pragmatically this time. Other conferences we're not responsible for. We can't speak about it. We can only speak about what we were responsible for.
I think that's actually a perfect way to end today's discussion, or to put a pause on an ongoing discussion. I'm trying to watch my own language right now, because I think the frustration, Armo, that you felt was the same frustration that I felt, and I was also sitting in the audience, and I'm technically a teacher here as well. I get very frustrated in all of the discussions within I don't even want to call it Palestine studies, but within sort of these walls of when they talk about pedagogy and in manahij, which is the curriculum, and all of this, a great deal of it, I don't want to say all of it, a great deal of it is top down. They're speaking as if the students are robots and they will be force-fed something, and if they're fed something poisonous, they will die. And we all know that students aren't like that. You know that, I know that. And if you want to understand pedagogy, you have to understand that there's an interactive, it's a relationship, just like we were talking about relations and everything else. I think that point is to be made, but I also think it's incumbent upon you and me to try to think about how can we construct that in the most productive way possible, and not mirror the classroom and the hegemonic power that a professor has over students in the classroom. So how can those discussions be made? And I think those are the kind of questions that I'm asking. Those are the kind of questions that a lot of us are asking, because it's our praxis. It's where we're standing right now. At least right now, I'm a professor at Birzeit University, so I try to understand what that means as a political being. So I just want to say one last thing, and it speaks to what Linda was saying about studying the PLO. As you all know, there's been a great deal of sort of hyper interest in settler-colonial studies and Israel, not Palestine. Settler-colonial studies in Israel. And I wrote something simple a few years ago, reminding people that Fayez Sayed was a person that wrote about settler colonialism in Palestine. He wrote from within the PLO. He did it by, the PLO paid for his book getting published, and he did it in the 70s. And why is nobody paying attention to that? Because that's the politics that Linda was talking about. He wasn't only writing for academic audiences. He was writing from a political praxis where he had a PhD. He was working on his academic work, but within this notion of what politics of liberation is. We can be critical of what that meant, but Yani, that's what he was doing, and that's sort of my own tension with Havana and that Tricontinental Congress moment, because that's a politics, right? And I think that's a politics that we can be critical of what it meant, but that's where the PLO is coming together and talking these, that's where these kind of connections were being made that ended up being academic things that we read about and talk about, but that space was a political space. And they were coming at it in a political space. That's like this notion of the third world, right? That's what I kind of want to keep in mind, because and this, I promise will be the last thing I say, is that Birzeit is a lot of things, Rabab. And there's no need to sort of say everything that it is. It's not, it is a space for resistance, and it's also a space for things that aren't very resistant mode-minded. Yeah, I think it's a bureaucratic university. It's a funded-based university. It has neoliberal issues. So I think really the thing about being here is actually really connected to being elsewhere, because the president of the university said what he said this morning because somebody righteous wrote him that speech, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to have something good to say about my union's demands tomorrow, right? So it's a great place, and it's a place where I've decided to dedicate myself to, but at the same time we have a struggle that is also a common struggle and a shared struggle between where you guys are in your universities or where I am in my university. This university is two things in one, and before you leave, I hope you have a chance, if you haven't yet, there's a memorial for the martyrs of Birzeit who have passed on in struggle, liberation. That is an important part of this university, but at the same time, you go up to the top of the hill and you'll see the new administration building. They can't afford to pay a decent wage, but they built a brand new administration building. So we have these, take it back, Lord. We have all these different contradictions that exist here as well as everywhere else. So again, that's a point of conversation. So I do hope with all of my heart that this conversation continues. And I thank you, Rabab, for paving the road every year, every 2 years, for these conversations to happen. And I thank every last one of you all as comrades and as friends and as brothers and sisters in this struggle. Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, we're on our way to Annapolis, and I'm willing to yield my spot for anyone who wants to speak. Really. Any student, any activist who wants to speak on my behalf, I'm happy to yield that, because I'd much rather be sitting there than up here speaking, because I really do believe that. But anyway.